Everyone, welcome. Welcome to Purify USA 2. We're so delighted that you're here. My name is Stephen Shelley, and this is my wife and partner, Teresa Scoba. Together, we are Ownstream, and we are thoroughly delighted today to welcome our very good friend, the wonderful Oracle girl, Dr. Jacqueline Hobbs. Jacqueline, welcome.
Hello, I'm so happy to be here again, especially in the silent immersion.
Well, yes, so this is our third time with Jacqueline. Jacqueline, it's so good to be with you as always. And one of many country purification events that you've done this year, though there's been a pause given the silent immersion. And Jacqueline is speaking to us from her silent immersion. So we're really grateful for that. We've been speaking to Jacqueline for some time about doing an event close to the US election. And we decided, and Jacqueline decided that doing this during the silent immersion was important and timely. So we are all excited, as I know you all are. So maybe we can get started. For people who are new, Jacqueline, maybe we can talk about what purification is and what does it mean to purify a country and its people? What is that about? What is this event about?
Well, sure. I mean, I think the first thing to say here is, this morning I was writing a post on Facebook and I thought, lots of new people and how to introduce myself and what I do and the Purify USA 2 tonight. And, essentially I'm from the future, which sounds a little bit way out, but I am the multi-dimensional version of you that has turned up in this time outside of the construct of the slave self. And I'm saying, there's a different possibility to the one that is being presented through your senses right now. And when it comes to the human being and the way that we operate, we actually have this most incredible range of skills that we can use, especially at this time, that maybe we're not even aware of, but we've always suspected that we've got somehow and somewhere in us. And actually, you have the ability to purify not only the slave self, that conglomerate of patterns inside you, which keeps you very limited and enslaved to certain systems and ideas, but also you can purify, if you like, the slave self or that conglomerate of patterns to do with others, to do with countries and places. And that's nothing to do perhaps with the healing paradigm or the more religious pathways that we've heard about. It's actually to do with your own superordinary abilities and your new upgraded identity in these times.
And since the summer, I believe you have hosted a variety of country-focused Purify events. And I thought it would be interesting to kind of pose this to you at the outset. Given when those began till now, a lot has happened and a lot of purifying has taken place. Maybe you can kind of give us a snapshot or some sort of portrait of where we are as a collective, as an overall civilization, kind of in thinking about the theme of purification.
Definitely. You know what? I think at the end of June or July, whenever it was, we looked back over the Purify events that we'd done, and it was a bit like, whoa, we went kind of crazy, didn't we? There was so much. And at some points, it was like 3 events a week. I don't know what happened. But, this is the whole point. There is now a frequency coming in which is rising and getting stronger and stronger in each person. And because we are equipped to purify and to generate a specific signal which makes us drop patterns and the slave self individually and in other places, what happens is when that really starts up, you have an area of specific instructions inside you which is ready for this time. And there's a meeting, if you like, with data banks and with intersections of pathways which are obsolete, which all come together in what I've been calling a Purify event. And it's like a communication from the inside out and the outside in between those different intersections of patterns and our own superordinary nature to get started and to go to the next level in actually just starting to slough all of that off and move through each different type of pattern that is ready to leave so that we can walk on from it. And it's not that certain patterns belong to certain countries, but what was happening in June and July was that the patterns were coming up in interconnection with certain places and also the people in the purification space who were connected with those countries. And then together we have worked through those patterns in our ability to purify. We ourselves have gone up to the next level, and then we have traveled on through the sequence, headed into the silent immersion, actually taken a bit of a break from some of the Purify sessions, and now we have returned because, of course, we are heading towards a big set of patterns now held together and exemplified by the USA, which is incredibly important and is ready to leave for the next stage of the historical story on this planet.
So perfect. So let's talk a little bit about the moment we're in here. And we've been in talking about this event, we've emphasized this isn't just about the USA, that this is a huge, massive moment for the world, which if anyone who's been listening to you and your reboot tracks and the Q&A will know that's the case. Let's talk a little bit about what is happening right now. Why is this a massive moment, and what does it mean? What's at stake here?
It's such a massive moment in our history. I mean, it's unbelievable what is occurring. On the one hand, yes, in a certain country on this planet, the USA, we have a pivotal election, and it seems as though there is a political race between two characters. But then in the broader picture, we have the fact that this planet now is diverting course away from a set of timelines which perhaps go towards a more destructive future, and is climbing upwards and onwards towards perhaps a lighter set of frequencies in one sense, which will say that it doesn't matter really who you have on the planet, that we're not going to have the same power structures in place. And we're not really going to have the same political processes, and certainly not the same economic system, and that there's going to be more equal power sharing. And whoever wins the electoral race, I mean, in some ways it doesn't really matter, because that onwards and upwards motion is going to happen anyway. It's actually the form that will be different according to who actually wins the USA election. And not just in America, it will be different for the whole planet because of the election in America as well, because it has a particular set of patterns, the USA, right now, that all of us are helping to purify, which says that we will not be ruled by the majority structures of power anymore. That is the pattern that is being purified, if you like, through the election. And whether it's Donald Trump or whether it's Joe Biden who wins the election, whatever power structures they have, that will be the last set of structures, if you like, politically on the planet that remain in place. They too will crumble, and then, if you like, we will rocket off into a more power sharing type of future, one way or the other. It may be more painful, it may be more easy, but one way or another, we will move away from political systems as a means of rulership anymore, and we will move into something more nature-based, more collective, more shared between people of all ages, races, creeds, doesn't really matter. And we will come into a collectivity which is not about the New World Order or any one particular order. It will actually be nature's order, and then it will be more of what people decide to do locally on the ground to start off with in their own communities. Because, of course, when you get that kind of scenario, actually it's all going to fall apart. The old system is leaving. It's going to be a right fuck up for a while. And everybody's going to be very dazed and confused, because even people who are really, really awake, we don't know how it's going to look We've got lots of fears and lots of excitement, but you know, this is unprecedented. And also, we're going to be facing down certain agendas as they sort of struggle to crawl back in as the big breakups occur. And that's probably something that we've never really been through. Most of us haven't been through a more physical world war. And the majority of us are certainly now in the experience of a type of psychology that some would call a war, where we are having to actually engage with different mindsets that we don't really want to be a part of, and we're fathoming how to deal with that, ward that off, circumvent it, overcome it, integrate it, or maybe even come into harmony with it and then overrule it. But we've never been through anything like this before, so it's going to be confusing, it's going to be messy, even though that is actually highly positive.
Yeah, I think this brings us to the question of voting and and kind of sensing the timelines that in the short term, because I think I think most of us would agree, kind of if we zoom out, we can see that all of these structures are they're built on sand, and they are inevitably going to topple. But in the short term, I guess, what is the meaning of a vote? Like, what does it mean to vote in an election such as this? Number one, and then number two, feeling into one side or the other, since we are left and right in this world, at least in this election, are there differences in the timelines as you sense them in the short term?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, human beings have got really rather hooked up with, you know, politics and voting. And of course, it is very important on one level, but it really depends who you are. Timelines continue whether you vote or not. And then, according to what type of coordinates that you hold in time and space as an individual, for some of you, it will be incredibly important to vote, because the way that you're hooked up, your vote and the way that you connect in with the political system, you'll actually dismantle it by
Hmm.
voting, because your frequency is set in a certain way to do that. And then others, and normally those are the people who don't really feel very into politics or that interested in it, they'll be just a bit like, eh, and maybe they won't vote at all, or maybe they'll do a tactical vote. It depends where your frequency is, who you are, and what kind of timeline you are operating on at this moment. You see, when you take into account all the different scenarios, this planet was heading on a scenario where whoever voted, however they voted, the planet was heading towards an enormous rupture in its ability to stay in contact even with other worlds and other dimensions. It's already been cut off from a great deal of them, and the timelines have dropped away where it's even possible for Earth to hook up to something more positive. And then recently, with the change in frequency and also with the raising of frequency of many, many human beings on this planet, we have started to once again replot the course of Earth and the timelines that are possible through the coordinates of each individual here into a more positive trajectory again. And then inside that, everybody starts to think about, am I going to vote or not? And what am I going to do? And so then you are in training your own personal instructions into that set of bigger pictures that I have just described. So, depending on what state you live in the USA, you may decide that it's better to do a tactical vote. You're already heading on a positive trajectory, and then perhaps because you live in a certain state where you can see that it might be dangerous or non-advisable to have a certain candidate get in, maybe you don't like the candidate that you're going to choose, but you choose them because you can see it would be better in your local or state context. Others will be on a slightly different trajectory, and they will think more nationally based, and they will think of the whole, and then they will cast their vote in that way if they vote. But it all happens inside that bigger picture of historical timelines and how we're hooked up with the universe.
Oh. Let's talk a little bit about how we got here and kind of what the agenda is for all of us behind this moment in time. So, you started by talking about the slave self, and you've been talking about the slave self a lot in recent tracks for a number of months. As a window to what we're experiencing right now, can we talk a little bit about what the slave self is and where did it come from?
Absolutely. It's a very important discussion. And for those of you who are new today, I really want to remind you that these are not just words. When I'm speaking, we are in the purification space, which is nothing more than just the zone within your own being that already knows how to purify and operates at that setting in that identity. And what's going on at the moment on this planet is that you are evolving a new biology. And I've been saying this now for many, many years in different ways. And I'm finding now that more and more people are kind of getting on the wavelength of really understanding what I'm saying to hold your whole multidimensional self. And when that starts to happen, not just a little bit of you, but all of you starts turning up here in physical time and space. So you start to realize that the system, your family, and even a certain version of your own self is occurring in you rather than you being trapped in a system or trapped in a body or caught here on earth in a certain undesirable way that you'd rather not be. And the slave self is actually a projection that has been, if you like, created by a certain part of your biology that it has made available through your senses and then almost convinced you, first of all, that you're just a body, that maybe you're the person with your name and your date of birth that exists in a certain place and on a corner of the planet, and that's about it. And then you have to do what you're told and you're subject to a system and rules. And nobody's saying that those things aren't real. They are real, but they're only a very small part of the story. And the slave self is actually an image, a suggestion that comes to you through your senses. And what happens is you get enamored of that and you believe it. And that then becomes your reality. It is real. And then it becomes all you experience. And what's happening now is because your multidimensional self is turning up so strongly, you're starting to realize, hey, this reality is not what I thought it was. And this reality, a lot of it is just a pile of crap. And I don't have to go along with this. And whoops, there are a lot of people who say that I do have to go along with this. Who the hell are they? Why do they say that? It's destructive. It's obviously not in my interest. It's not in nature's interest. It's not in the interest of the planet. What is going on? Some people describe that as the waking up moment, whatever you want to call it, but most of us have been feeling that and thinking that probably from day one anyway, and then to progressively larger extents, to the point now where we're all extremely frustrated because we're like, hey, you know, we've just been waiting and waiting for all of this to come down, and it's really time for it to go now. That slave self projection, which is actually wired into your DNA, is ceasing to have the effect and the influence on you anymore, your multidimensional self, that it used to. A few years ago, maybe it was 75% of you. These days, it's about 10. And it's the same with the rest of the system and society. It's all starting to buckle and come down. Not for everyone, but they are in that reality whether they realize it or not, of it all coming down, but their multidimensional self just hasn't turned up yet because their biology is not able to hold those higher frequency ranges. So actually what's going on the planet right now is not only the dismantling of the slave self, which was historically wired into us, into our genetics, but actually the other part of us, which has nothing to do with our genetics and which influences and controls our genetics, is upgrading our body, is overriding the slave self and dismantling it. It's sending the actual frequency of the planet up as well. It's not that the planet's going up and we're waking up. We're sending Earth up in frequency because of the other bit of us that is not confined by our genetics. We're mutating our own DNA quite naturally and automatically because we are dreamers. And this is what we all were talking about, weren't we, last time that we were together on here? Because the human being is actually a dreamer. And when we dream, we raise our frequency and we override our DNA. And when you come into contact with the purification space and you meet yourself at this frequency, you start to accelerate that dismantling. You switch on those instructions inside you, which integrate and overrule that slave self. And then you embody more and more of yourself, which switches on others and can be used to then actively dismantle other things as well.
So, wow, that's truly extraordinary. You know, as I'm listening to you, I'm finding my slave self thinking, okay, how do I do this? What how does this work? Where, you
That's
know,
correct. Your
where,
slave self asks that all the time. How do I do it? How do I do it? Because the slave self doesn't have any free will. The slave self is bound to obey instructions. So it never stops asking questions. It never stops worrying about what it's going to do because it doesn't know. And the slave self just runs on a program, which, as mathematics has discovered and many of the great scientists, it's all on a program.
and this slave self comes from somewhere or some place. I don't even know the right noun to use, but it is generated from some place. Can you speak about that at all, and
Sure.
the perhaps the agenda or the intention behind that as it relates to the rising, this kind of current of energy you're describing as the earth is rising, and maybe how these two things are breaking apart?
Yeah. Are you ready, guys? We've been heading towards this area for a long time, really. And it's really important that we understand that when we talk about these things, what we're not talking about before we go into it, really, because we're not talking about religion here, we're not talking about politics, we're not even talking about an alternative history, because that's all actually resonating in that whole bandwidth, that whole wavelength of the slave self. We're coming directly now from multi-dimensionality, and we're on that universal wavelength now that just about freaking everybody knows except for human beings, and quite a lot of human beings know now. The slave self comes from those who designed the slave self. And the slave self was designed by other beings who came to Earth. Just hold still and breathe. Some people will not be shocked by that, and others will be. And don't worry if you're shocked by it. It's okay. You're still going to get up tomorrow and brush your teeth, go out and do the day. It doesn't need to make any difference if it doesn't resonate for you. Okay? And actually what's happening right now is a very strong purification for anybody for whom this is a shock. Just a bit like some of my newsletters, actually, where suddenly you think, "Ugh," and you read something and think, what? I don't like the sound of that. And you feel all of these feelings come up that make you feel very uncomfortable. That's part of the purification. And if you read those newsletters, of course, you'll realize that I'm not saying exactly what your emotions are telling you, but something needs to clear through you first. Then you can just sit with what I'm saying and see if it resonates. And if it doesn't, no problem. I come from a timeline in the future where these things are extremely well known and understood. And I'm just bringing that into this timeline as a suggestion for everybody to do with what they want. And you will pick up the frequencies that you need from this space, and you will travel on because you are always in control. You have the sovereignty over your own source connection, your own life, and your own physical reality. You can hit the button anytime and say, I don't want to listen to that, and that's fine. Nobody will take it personally. So, the slave self was designed. And what happened is that at a certain point, an aspect of you and your multi-dimensional self got entangled with the projection of the slave self, and the two got bound together. And then, because you had never experienced a body before, a body suddenly turned up in your reality space. And because Earth is a very, very dense and physical place, and it has the ability to materialize anything, suddenly, whoop, instead of being a multidimensional being, you were the physical embodiment of a slave self and not all that much else. And the bit of you that, if you like, was aware that maybe those things could happen in you and separate from you got smaller, or let's say less powerful, and suddenly you experienced yourself as this very physically organized beginning and end kind of being that's separate from others as displayed through your senses, and you were on another journey. That journey is temporary because all of that is now coming off, and you are starting to experience, if you like, that lightness and that infinity that you are, with that limitedness and that slave self-reality inside you, rather than it being the other way round. We've been brought up with the idea that we have a body and that maybe we even exist inside a body, and then, you know, infinity, or if you like, our limitlessness is somewhere out there or in there, and we'll find it and then we'll throw it all off and then we'll be back to who we should be. But actually it's all the other way round. So that's what happened, and it happened a very long time ago. And now, because things have changed so much, all of that is wearing off. And as a result of that, human beings are now so powerful, but they don't even realize, because they are left still with the partial memories of their limitedness and the instructions in their biology that they must obey. So we've got this really weird situation now where everybody's jogging around in masks thinking, I fucking hate this, but I have to do it. And there's a part of everybody that knows, this is not right, but I'll wait until the waking up happens for everyone, and then we'll take the damn things off and everything will be okay, because then all of that old stuff, the old system will have fallen, the slave self will have fallen away, etc., etc., and then we can go into the new reality. We've got these two sort of worlds crashing together at the moment, but it's actually the slave self that has that dialogue and thinks that it can kind of bridge or manage the situation, and that's the death that's going on. It's a death, if you like, of not just the system that was given to us to experience our infinite being through that enslaved us, we are losing the whole identity of any type of slavery and the identity of those who created the slave self and gave us the projection of the body. And by the way, they gave us the projection of God as well. They made God in their own image, and then they told us that that God had made us in its own image. And so then we thought, oh, we have to obey and we have to serve this higher power. And that was then projected into politics, religion, economics, science, the whole damn lot. Even our families, our relationships, our cellular structure. That whole identity, that slave self, and all of the different projections that we've ever experienced, all those different types of slave selves throughout history, throughout all the different sequences of being that we've experienced ourselves as through that projection. We can call the whole conglomerate, if you like, the not self, all of that identity of the human being. You could call it, human Mark 1 or 2 or whatever you want to call it. We're leaving that behind now and we're going into a new human, a completely different human who's nothing to do with that historical, if you want to call it, circumstance.
Oof. I feel the purification very strongly.
Yeah, shall we just stop there just for a minute? Because there's a lot going on here, and I didn't used to actually open the silent immersion at all into the public space until it was finished. And so there are some people joining today who are not on the silent immersion retreat, who may have signed up and joined for tonight. It's a very powerful space. And so let's just close our eyes for a second. Just because sometimes when you close your eyes, you have more of a sense of your own solidity and your senses don't distract you so much. That's the only reason. We're not doing anything spiritual or religious here. I'm not really very into those things. Just feel the margins of your body. You are purifying right now. The not self, that whole identity that exists within the bandwidth of that system of slavery and entrapment. And realizing that you're just doing it, and actually you do it all the time. That's who you are. That's your multidimensional identity, your new human identity. And you receive on so many different frequencies other than just the frequency of that not self. And the whole apparatus, the whole technology of the slave self. And somewhere in you, you've always known this. It's just happening. So I don't need to heal you. We don't need to do anything. We don't need to visualize. We don't need to pray. I don't need to do a session on you, especially not individually. Because you do it. There's nothing to get you out of. And because that's what I do in this space, it's what you do automatically. You just switch into it because it's just about company. When you're around happy people, often you switch into the happy version of your own self. It's the same thing. You just align more deeply with your own self at that frequency setting. So nobody's putting anything into you. You're not putting anything into anyone else. Nobody's taking anything out of you. Nobody's changing anything about you. Nobody's modifying you. You're just directly connecting into your own source connection, your infinity setting, and it's embodying, which automatically purifies. And the more people who join this broadcast, past, present, and future, because people will listen to this maybe a year down the road if they go on the website and get the link. The more people who plug in, it just keeps increasing in power, and the purification gets stronger and stronger because the numbers, like volume, just amplify the strength of the purification that we are all collectively initiating. Once you start to resonate at a certain frequency, you don't do anything else but purify and generate that signal 24 hours a day. So you're not dependent on anyone or anything to do this. You're already in the space, at the setting where you do it constantly, because it's your identity, your multidimensional identity. And this is the future positive timeline that I am talking about, which is the alternative future for this planet. And when you operate this way, you are embodying it for this planet. Even before we turn our attention to the USA and the election, which of course we will do as well tonight. Keeping your attention on your body. You are the purification 24 hours a day. And slave self versions of you and your reality pop up as alternative pathways and timelines which tell you that you can't do this, but you can learn. Or if you pay, you can have it, but maybe you'll have to do it in dribs and drabs, this bit first, then that bit, come back again. That's all the slave self. You don't need that anymore, but you may well dip in and out of it from time to time until you get really thoroughly established in this identity physically. It's you. Just opening your eyes again when you're ready. Just, shall we remind everyone about the aftercare page on my website? It's really good to give that a read after watching these broadcasts, because all sorts of things start happening to you physically. This is very, very physical, very real. Your body rearranges. You can have lots of physical sensations, as well as notice changes in your relationships, your emotional ties. And there are things that you need to make sure as well that you are really conscious about as you start to really learn how to live your new identity, your actions and your behaviors must match this frequency. This frequency is all about doing what you say and saying what you do. It's really safe because if you make a mistake or you don't, you find out really quickly, because nature comes in very strongly to correct you, and maybe a situation turns up in your life where suddenly people get upset or something breaks away and it's just not possible anymore to do what you were. But please give that page a read on my website. It's in the About section, and that will help you navigate beyond this group.
Thank you.
That's wonderful. I think it's time we should also sort of just say to those with us live, like if you have questions, please feel free to post those in the chat. That is being tracked, and these will be extracted and sent to us. We'll do our very best to get to those. And for the questions proposed when you register, we have a list that we will get to shortly. So do know that those will be coming soon. The traditional Q&A that'll be coming up. Feels like we both want to jump in. I think maybe just to be sure that this is included now, the gold frequency is a big theme of the silent immersion, and
Sure.
Maybe you could clarify its specific role in this purification process and the dropping of the slave self. Since we've just had this beautiful purification, maybe this is the moment to really speak to that.
Yeah, it's so important. You know, in your body you have gold. You've got many precious metals, or let's just say a certain form of metals in your body, but around your actual heart apparatus and in your brain, there is gold. And gold is your internet. That's how you connect with other beings. All this telepathy and stuff that gets talked about in more non-physical circles is how you actually function in terms of hooking up with others. Gold is the way that you access your interrelational, your interdimensional pathways, and you can hear and you know what others are feeling. It's how nature communicates with you, and it's how in general you pick up and receive all the signals through different timelines and through different dimensions and spaces and times, and you come to know through your senses what is going on. So although we have gold in our bodies, and then of course in our minds that conjures up, you know, pictures of gold bars and solid gold necklaces or whatever you like, gold as a metallic element that you can feel and touch. What I want to encourage you to understand is that when we then talk about gold as a frequency, we are just talking about the seen and unseen way that the gold in your body helps to facilitate that universal internet, if you like, that everybody is on. So gold actually really is a frequency. And because Earth has a way of materializing everything, it then turns up in a solid elemental form for us as well in this reality. And we sometimes get confused about the two. Gold is a way of being and communicating that we can call a frequency. And I've really drawn our attention to that during the immersion because, of course, what has happened? Let's go back to our little chat a little while ago about the slave self and where it came from and what it was. Okay. The beings who designed the slave self and brought about the body and all that happened in that story, they needed more of that gold frequency to operate on. They needed the gold frequency. Now, if you go into conspiracy theory and some of the alternative histories, you'll hear stories about slave workers and digging for gold and all that kind of stuff. Well, you could say it's true up to a point if you pack it down and convert it into a very materialistic and limited, semi-false understanding of what was going on. But actually, at this broader level, what was occurring was that those beings were fascinated by and needed more of that way of being for themselves. And when they came here, they realized that in the very material atmosphere and materialization set of possibilities that are here on Earth, that they could actually design something where they captured, as an experiment, a very neutral and objective experiment, those universal wavelengths, and they could access more of the universe themselves, which would help with the perpetuation of their own species. So this was not some negative alien attack. Those are ideas that have been given to you by certain political bodies on this planet who have their own agendas, and some religious as well, perhaps. There's no need to get into all of that. That's what we call the realm of conspiracy theory, which those of you who've been with me for quite some time understand is something that I'm really not in favor of, and I don't like very much. The gold frequency is something that is very fascinating for all species, because the gold frequency develops and upgrades DNA. So we've got something very interesting here. We've got some beings in this universe who operate with DNA and want to access more of what I'm calling the gold frequency, which is just really a mathematical number of a certain wavelength, a frequency vibration in this universe. And they want to develop and access more of the infinity of their own being. And they want to thrive with more of that. And then, of course, you've always got, just like, human beings, you've got, other beings who, would like to, have the lion's share of all of that. And wouldn't it be a good idea, if they even, manipulated the DNA so that they could get others to do what they wanted and give them more access to that universal frequency through the DNA of others, if they were having a bit of trouble integrating it in themselves and they were still learning about it. I mean, there's all sorts of agendas out there. And so the gold frequency, on the one hand, if you really understand it deeply, is something that upgrades the DNA and gives you more access to a physical experience of this universe. So you don't need to manipulate your DNA. We don't need to know anything about our DNA. Actually, it will upgrade and it will sort itself out all by itself. If we open ourselves into our own infinite nature and we refuse to accept anything that tells us that we are not infinite beings, okay? And then on the other hand, we've got, agendas which feel that we need to manipulate our DNA in order to change ourselves and make ourselves into a better species or go in a certain direction, which can be for a variety of agendas. Some of them may be slightly more positive, but still very short-sighted, and some of them are just downright limited and, destructive, and we don't want them. And well, seeing as we're getting really sort of out there, we might as well include a couple of other things as well. There are, some life forms in this universe who don't have DNA at all. And they want it. And they need it. And, that's going on as well on this planet.
So wanting to get into explicitly the negative high frequency beings, as I know that we mentioned that in advance of this broadcast, maybe we can talk explicitly about those negative high frequency beings, and also if we overcome the slave self, assuming we can, which we received some questions about. If we can overcome the slave self, how does that affect those negative high frequency beings and what they want right now?
First of all, you cannot not overcome the slave self. It is guaranteed. So it's not whether you can, it's only when you will. Okay. And then you get into the complexity of where everybody else is up to alongside yourself and how long it's going to take for all of this to get sorted out. Okay, so that's the first thing. Can you just ask me the second bit of your question again to continue on? Because
Yes.
was very focused in that answer as part of the purification to really get that resonating in this space for everyone. This is not spirituality where if only you pray yourself hard enough, you'll get there. And it's not politics or economics where if you're moral enough or if you work hard enough and you vote for the right person, you might get there. It's none of that. Okay, it's going that way anyway, and it just depends what kind of form gets taken in that process according to the other trajectories that then start to coincide with that happening with all beings. Okay,
Yes, thank you. That was very clear.
back to you.
So not if, I'll say, as we overcome the slave self, then what effect does this have on negative high frequency beings, their agenda and what they want from us right now?
Yes, okay. So just for the benefit of some people who might be newly joining, okay, because in the Purify series, after we did countries, we then went on to purify our leaders, which I think we were all a bit desperate to get to because we were all getting a bit worried as, you know, it dawned on a lot of people that some of the things were coming in were not going away and that all sorts of very strange measures were coming into our societies. And we were looking at our leaders and thinking, hell, we knew you were bad, but not that bad. We realized that, you know, this lot have really either got to change or they've got to go. So we did purify our leaders. And in that, I started to really point out that, you know, our leaders, they're just puppets. You know, I mean, most of you know this, but not everyone, of course. But, you know, they are controlled. And actually, many of our leaders are, you know, not really high frequency positive beings, but you know there are definitely, you know, people who have very good intentions in our political structures. Of course, it's no different to any other structure on earth. There are people with, you know, varying degrees of positive intention, but they are controlled by other factions which are nothing to do with what politics they have, which country they're in. It's not sort of, you know, one country versus another. And there are many different types of subsections and interests that go across countries and in and out of different political structures and economic sponsors and even, you know, secret societies and all of that stuff that we hear about quite accurately within the realm of conspiracy theories. So there are shadow controllers behind our leaders, and they will perhaps occupy certain industries or even be privately contracted to do certain things, intersecting them with government departments or even organizational bodies outside of government departments, and they interact together. But then there are also shadow controllers who are linked to, you know, families and bloodlines and particular corporations. And everything's a corporation, of course. Even we are corporations as defined through the slave self system. And there are particular, if you like, DNA or, you know, genetic organizational structures which pull strings and have an effect on, you know, the lot that we see on the TV screen or on the computer screen who go, you know, one day, well, you've got to do this. And then the next day they go, no, you don't, you have to do that. And then the day after they say, yeah, but I always meant this, and so on and so on. Okay. So there's shadow controllers. And then I have introduced another term just to keep you all on your feet. Which is negative high frequency beings, which is what you're asking about. Because you see, if you think about the multidimensional setup right now, okay, you have a multidimensional being And then you experience that through a slave self projection to the extent that that is all still hooked up. And that's dependent on how much it's still in society, as well as how much it has purified out of your own system yet. Okay. So the multidimensional self, it embodies and it becomes more and more real and physical. But a lot of it can be very non-physical for a lot of people, especially if they haven't woken up yet. So in the same way, beyond the confines of our senses in our everyday world, shadow controllers are still what you might loosely refer to as the people that you would accept are in this world, sitting at a desk, maybe in a certain corporation or on their beach in Bermuda or wherever the hell they are, watching the stock exchange and how much money they're making out of everybody's deaths. And, they are physically, if you like, somebody who you could travel to the other side of the world and tap on the shoulder and go, hey, I don't really like what you're doing. And then there is another aspect to this beyond shadow controllers, who we might say who are embodied in the slave self projection, who are outside of all of that. So we have to say they are multidimensional. But then we would say that in general, maybe they had a negative agenda rather than a positive one. And certainly the timelines and where their view of what should be happening is going would bring harm or destruction for what's going on in this time space reality. They are not in the body. They do not have a strong connection with the slave self technology. The slave self technology was designed, and it was designed by a number of different groups of visitors. And because they were a little bit dodgy, they didn't really get on very well with each other either. Okay, so they are not in this reality. Okay, they are outside of this reality and the projection that they actually designed. And then there are other beings who had nothing to do with the design of the slave self technology, who love it, think it's the best show in town, and they want more. And they want to buy in. And they want to influence through that projection. They want to glue themselves into that projection, because then they gain access to DNA and the gold frequency, and they can start to infiltrate into all of the multidimensional universe for more of their own agenda. Just because you're multidimensional, by the way, doesn't mean that you can turn up in all dimensions simultaneously. You are locked into certain dimensional experiences according to your own coordinates and universal law. A little bit complex. We won't get into all of that today.
Well, one question that's come through the chat, which I feel would be relevant now.
Sure.
And I'm sensing there may be a connection here, but I want to ask it to be sure that it is or it isn't, so that you can clarify. But are you suggesting that the negative high frequency beings are those who created the slave self? Is there a connection there?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, because those beings who created the slave self, they are outside of that projection. And most of them, not all of them, because there were a number of groups, but most of them, let's just say they had limited self-interest. And now they have become part of, let's say, groups of high frequency beings who also don't have access to DNA at all, who most certainly have a negative agenda for what's happening here. So loosely, yes. Originally, those who designed the slave self, there were some who actually had quite positive intention, although it was limited. So it's quite complicated, actually.
And I'm probably asking this question for many of us out there, but who have heard all sorts of rumors about the people behind these quote shadow controllers. But people have referred to the Anunnaki, the reptilians, all of these different kind of beings do they actually fall into this equation anywhere, or is that just conspiracy theory and there's no application there?
A lot of that, it depends what specific cases you're talking about, and of course they've all got different histories to their story now as
Yeah.
well. But some of those things have been suggested by negative high frequency beings, and it's then infiltrated the mind of beings who are here, who have then started to play out and live that story in this reality, so that that negative high frequency being can then gain access to this space. And it's just a straightforward case of possession, because those beings normally would have no access. So how do they have the influence here and get in? They have to have something that is enticing and heavy, and something that is in the interest of the being that is embodied to glue onto. And there's a suggestion of power there. And that's a person, sitting somewhere in this world who feels powerless. That drops into their head. Well, most of us wouldn't even sort of go into it and dismiss it if we were even able to receive that kind of idea. But some people who feel very powerless can receive a projected idea like that, grip onto it, start to believe it, even act it out, and then write a book about it, and then influence other people, set up a whole secret society about it, get money and power, and then actually start to embed that whole reality into this planetary timeline. That has certainly happened with some of the things that get called conspiracy theory. And you see, the funny thing about conspiracy theory is that, some of those things, don't know if you can hear the cuckoo clock in the background, it's very beautiful. A Swiss addition to the group today. Is that the amazing thing about conspiracy theories is that they're kind of not true, and they are true because they're not, which I know sounds a bit stupid, but some of those things were complete suggestion by negative high frequency beings. They then moved into this reality, and they actually became something that happened, and then maybe they died out and they don't happen anymore, so it's all in the realm of fiction, or only part of it is true. It's also nuanced. But nine times out of 10, a lot of the stuff in those realms that we hear about that's called conspiracy theory, it isn't true. It never was true, but it got inserted into this reality through that negative higher frequency being pathway, and then it got played out by embodied beings, and then became a reality to a small extent, which then ignited a zeitgeist at certain points in history, particularly now, for example, when there's crisis or there's trauma in history, and it took root even more deeply, which is what that negative high frequency agenda needs, because it can't actually show up here in the body. Does that help?
Yes.
So many different strands, to be honest.
Yeah, I know we said this could go hours, this talk, if we wanted to. I wanna turn attention to what we do about this agenda, basically, and how this relates to next week and all of our actions and non-compliance. So you recently shared in one of your newsletters a cover of The Economist, and there was a video attached to that. But some of the gist of this message was that by that the Illuminati or the shadow controllers put into The Economist a message for us at the end of last year that basically put us on notice of the events that were going to transpire this year. So I'm curious about and in that video, they suggested that they must do that because they know we have free will, and they must put us on notice so that we can consent by receiving that notice. Something to that effect. You can correct me, Jacqueline. But basically, is that true that they do that? And also, if that is true, how do we stand up? Is declaring our sovereignty part of standing up against this? Are the actions we're going to take next week against medicalization, is that part of this? Like, how do we stand up and say that we do not comply?
What we need to do is bring this, first of all, right back into the context of the USA election. So, right now, in the next week or so, a lot of Americans are going to decide to cast their vote, and we're going to come out with one candidate or another. And whichever trajectory gets chosen, we're going to see the collapse of our old society and the collapse of whichever, if you like, faction that person represents, or politics, or set of advisors and theories. And then we're going to move into a very liminal zone for quite some time, where we start to rebuild our societies and thresh out what we want. Now, on this planet, there are all sorts of people who aren't in charge, who want to be in charge, and who are in charge and think that even more of what they think should be in charge, and they're all vying and jostling for power. Some of that is off-world, and some of that is on-world, if I can just use those terms to distinguish perhaps between what is inside and outside the realm of material and physical capability. Okay. What's happening here at the moment is that through the lens of the election, we are seeing the force of our purifying ability slough off anywhere where the frequency of negative high frequency beings is influencing. So the first answer to your question is, you haven't got to do anything other than be who you are in your purest multidimensional definition, because you are driving the purification and you are the one who is deciding the future. Actually, all of that lot in power, they don't realize it, but every day when they get up, what they're doing is they're voting for you. Because they're on a certain timeline which is dismantling, and the more they do that and be who they are, the more they speed to the natural end of that timeline, which will then dismantle, because that's taking place in the bigger picture of you, who is driving the changes of what's happening on this planet. Then within that, you've got something like The Economist magazine, okay? And on that magazine, turned up a picture. Who knows what that actual cover was? And who knows within The Economist as well as outside of The Economist, exactly, let's say, what balance of forces was going on through that image. But what we're saying here, and what I was saying in that newsletter, is, should you be looking at that, trying to work all that out, to what degree it's positive or negative, to what degree there's a message there or there isn't, to what degree that guy on that video with the Elvis haircut and the other buggy-eyed guy who was looking at him trying to explain it all, and even that very dour woman who's going, this is very serious. Should we be looking there, or should we be looking at this incredible reset? And that's what the American election is, because whoever gets in, do we really realize how big this is? We've got one candidate who says, we don't know truthfully or not, but we've got one candidate who says that medicalization will not be mandatory. And then we've got another candidate who says it will, effectively. If we get the one that says it's not mandatory, then what's going to happen? The whole world is going to stand up and go to their own governments, that guy is not making medicalization mandatory. We want the same. Or maybe if the other candidate gets in, who is making it mandatory, and people don't agree, then you may see an opposite reaction. The patterns in the USA right now are about plugging everybody back into what they want. And whichever candidate gets in, what's going to be triggered is the populace standing up and looking at that candidate and at America as a whole and going, we do or we don't want that timeline. We want our timeline. So the deeper answer to your question about, what we can do and our own sovereignty is you really need to get in touch with your own self through the USA election process, whether you're American or not, whether you're voting or not, whether you're political or not, whether you've ever read The Economist or not, whether you watched that dodgy video and thought, oh, I definitely think that's probably true, or God, that was just awful, I didn't like that. Plug back into the information that that process gives you, because the patterns that are there in the election and in everything that hooks into it are bringing up all of that information for you through your own purification process to stand up and go, this is what I want. This is what I'm going to do. This is who I am. And it's going to sharpen the definition on you as a sovereign being. And by a sovereign being, I mean that multidimensional identity that receives and works on the gold frequency, that mutates your own DNA in an ever upward direction, a more embodied expression of infinity consciousness that does no harm and that is non-destructive. That's what you can do. It's a much deeper political process that is going on in each being that is a frequency matter that I am pointing to by bringing out and using all these different tools around us, which are all part of just that slave self system. I hope that makes sense. And if it doesn't, don't panic, okay? Most of what I say never makes sense. It comes in, it comes out, and you change anyway because your own source connection decides what's to do, and it works on the frequency that is right for it. So don't worry about it.
Well, we have a number of people in our midst who are exploring the kind of declaration of sovereignty, the kind of the legalities around that, which is very interesting. And you kind of hinted at this when you talked about we're each a corporation and the US is a corporation. And that's a whole rabbit hole maybe for another time to pull that apart. But is there any value in kind of claiming that in the legal sense now, especially now, or is that kind of a sidetrack that maybe we shouldn't overemphasize?
What's most important now is that we really deeply engage with the sovereignty process that I just described through the American election. And then as part of that, what's already happening is that human beings are discovering that there is a whole raft of legal and political processes out there which are very different to the mainstream presentation of our everyday legal and economic systems. Some people will have the mind and the interest to get involved with that and look into that. And all of that more political sovereignty process, which you're describing, points to one fundamental fact, which is that at the end of the day, the bottom line is that we're all going back to the principles of nature, or what some people call natural law, that the systems that depart from that or that are not modeled on that are weakening and breaking up. And there are also tools available politically and legally that you can use to help break it up further and extricate yourself from it if you wish to. But that's down to the kind of person that you are and what you're into. It's within the bigger matter of the sovereignty of your own being as an infinite being and a multidimensional being.
Yep, got it. Thank you.
Maybe we can take this moment to follow up a little bit on what you just said about the patterns. You've talked about a few of the patterns playing and what we will need to purify. And some of that's about, like you're saying, just what's coming up for each of us. But maybe you can say a little bit more about the patterns at stake in this selection. What are we seeking to purify?
Yeah. So shall we all once again just really become aware of our own body even though it's a part of the slave self technology, we have claimed it as our own, and now we are starting to grow it in our own direction. So that's how we experience ourselves, becoming ever more solid in this moment, just as we actually are turning up right now in this space. You can keep your eyes open or closed, it really doesn't matter. Do what suits you. These patterns currently showing up and purifying through the events in the USA connected with the election. First of all, speeding up now the purification of any of those denser filters that prohibit all beings on the planet from really understanding that freedom is not so much about politics, but the infinity aspect of each and every one of us in our own biology. Nothing you need to do. You're here, and you showed up. Switching on deeper aspects, first of all, of your own self through the lens of whatever remnants of the slave self technology you still have. Coming into more direct awareness of all the hidden aspects of who you are and how external society buries that when it presents that back to you through the senses. And just realizing, if you have your eyes open, that my hands just move because they move. I'm not actually making what I'm describing happening. I am speaking as it happens. And my hands move as well, all as one action. Receiving this purification from your own self-healing ability. First of all, for any aspect of you that has become caught in the fear or the illusion of any political system impacting on the American electoral process and world politics as a whole right now. Releasing that and where it is held in place by the slave self. You already have this ability to do this, and you are doing it right now. Receiving this purification from your own self-healing ability, direct through your own source connection. And now purifying the frequency of the patterns of the slave self attached to the USA and the American electoral process, bringing everything more deeply and more closely into that future positive timeline and that zero setting without negative agendas, destruction of the environment, nuclear outcomes, poverty, starvation and food security issues. Lovely. I'm just the commentary on what you are already doing. I'm like a mirror, receiving this purification from your own self-healing ability, direct through your own source connection. For all beings who may at this point in history blindly vote in a way that upholds the loss of freedom in the name of something false or duplicitous that has not been fully exposed in our world societies, should that exist. Receiving this purification from your own self-healing ability, direct through your own source connection. For all beings controlled by negative high-frequency beings who are in positions of power in the political and electoral processes in the USA. Staying aware of your body. No need to change anything. Beautiful. The positive future timeline, which is already coming in, accelerates and rearranges the future when we do this. And it happens to the extent that all of us in the purification space have already embodied our own infinity. Multiplied by the number of people in the space, past, present, and future. And of course, you are connected with many, many people and beings. It's good. Just slowly opening your eyes if you had your eyes closed. Noticing this is not about being in silence or Zen or getting into meditation or doing it. None of that. It can be very hard to understand how much impact you really have and how powerful you are when you look outside the window every day and you see people walking around like automatons with bits of cloth over their face, and you hear about the next wave of restrictions coming in, and you just think that this is utter fantasy, even though you kind of know it's true as well. But actually, it is the multi-dimensional picture that is ruling the airwaves. And when everything cracks and that freedom comes into view finally, then you will realize that all of this is what that was about. And so first of all, we go through a tightening of restrictions, a more extreme craziness, and then inevitably we will get, more people refusing to go along with it. Maybe more violence or protests or whatever. Hopefully not, but it is naturally what happens in these situations, especially when large numbers are involved. Then it starts to really crack open. Maybe even after that, physically, it gets worse for a while because so much gets disrupted. But that actually is part of the positive timeline. And for a while, everything will be very back to front and not make sense because we have been experiencing everything through that slave self. And we are coming out of that, back into that realization and that experience of the slave self being in us, the other way round. That's why it's all so crazy. But don't worry.
Well, it feels like we ought to dive into Q&A.
Great.
We have quite a few,
That's
we'll monitor the time here, but we're at about 90 minutes now, and
okay.
Sort of unofficially made this 2 hours, but it's open for us if it's open for you. But
I'm okay so far.
We'll follow the river.
The computer's fine, so we're all on.
Great. Okay, to begin with, and this was one that we kind of wanted to feature. I think we discussed this in our pre-chat, but this question reads as follows. My husband has been in this space for as long as me, but he doesn't consciously participate listening to tracks, etc. He knows he is in, and I selectively send him tracks I feel he is more likely to listen. He rarely does. Does purification work on the same level for him as it works for me, who is actively participating? I definitely see positive changes in him, but for instance, this immersion has been the easiest for me by far, whereas I see him struggling this immersion. Thank you.
Yeah, it definitely works exactly the same, but for someone who is less conscious, or maybe to rearrange it is slower for them, there will be more pain. The purification happens regardless, and sometimes it's easy and sometimes it's hard. There's never the question of whether the purification happens, it's just whether it's more fluid and there's less resistance, or whether it's more bumpy and more physically and emotionally challenging. And those who let's say it's not a negative thing necessarily, because you see everybody comes into conscious awareness at exactly the right time for a family network and even a relationship. But when that consciousness is, let's say, not level pegging, say with a partner or with the frequency of a family group, then you get massive differences and distortions in the outside world and how you all bump up against each other, and that can be very painful. Unless someone sort of says, well, I know I'm in the space take me out, um, the purification will continue exactly the same. If someone asks to be taken out of the space, I think it's very good to explain what happens, because what you're saying effectively is, right, okay, you signed me up. I don't want to be in anymore. Please take me out. So, the person writes on Jacqueline at and says, please cancel, or whatever, or you go in your donor account and you cancel. So what happens is there is a disconnect then from the purification that I am doing as part of everything that I offer in collaboration with you guys. But you will continue to purify that person who's asked to be disconnected, whether you like it or not, because your biology has got up to a certain stage, if you like, with accessing that frequency range of your own self. Nobody can change that because that's under universal law, it's under nature's principles. You can say, I don't want to go along with that anymore, and that, of course, is your right. But you can't stop a plant from growing unless you kill it. And you are going to arrest that process and go in a different direction, which is your choice. But it doesn't mean that necessarily the purification will stop. It's just that there will be no more involvement with the purification space externally. The purification space externally is just the part of you that always has and always will purify, and keeps on embodying. Okay?
And so for that reason, to clarify, Jacqueline, it doesn't actually matter if you know you're in the purification space
No.
either, right? Because you can enter, for anyone who's newer to this and thinking about this in advance of next week, for example, you can enter political figures, you can enter really anyone or anything.
Definitely enter a couple of political figures, please. But no, it's not like I should draw a distinction here, say, between, therapy or which is a very different type of activity where you would ask for permission, and you certainly, wouldn't do something on someone else's behalf without them actually being consciously told or knowing. The actual human apparatus, the biology, and even your DNA, the gold frequency, you naturally connect with all of existence and all beings. You are naturally a connective being. So in that scenario, in a way, it's kind of ridiculous to say to someone, do you mind if I put you in the external purification space, because they're already in it? What you're doing when you're signing someone up is you're actually placing the slave self, the projected image of that person in the space, which isn't them, which isn't even theirs. And you are entering it because there is a movement in you that seems to say that would be a good thing. And of course, some people worry sometimes. And think, well, what if that isn't a wholesome desire, or what if it's out of alignment, or it's my own selfish, interest, and I just want to change them, and actually I'm wrong. It's fine, because it won't work, you see. If you sign someone up for a purification and it maybe it's someone else who needs it, and maybe even your own self, that's where the purification will go, because it's governed by your own source connection. So this is a completely different thing. And you see, we get into something that's very hard to talk about in a way, because we're dealing with the multidimensional and we're dealing with the slave self reality, and how the two sort of work together. And that's where language can get a bit tricky. And, I get a lot of people who say, oh, well, I don't want to become dependent on this. But you see, they're talking about something that they feel is separate and that they might become enslaved to. They're talking about their own slave self and that world. Because you can't leave that universal internet that you're a part of. You're an infinite being. You're dependent on nature. You're dependent on your loved ones. You're dependent on the air that you breathe, because you should be. And you don't ever want to escape from that. You want to work seamlessly and wholesomely with that. And you want to benefit all beings and make this world an even more beautiful place. So it's not so much about getting out of the purification space. It's more about leaving behind the slave self technology, which certainly does induce a dependency in a false way, covering over the interdependency, which is entirely healthy, that you already have and that you are. I hope that makes sense.
Excellent. Yes. Thank you so much for that explanation. Here's another question. You mentioned that you've come from the future back to this time to help us. If this is so, do you have any idea how things pan out? I personally have a lot of fear around sharing the planet with non-empathic automatons. We have enough of those in our governments and control systems. And in one of your Q&As, you mentioned that the shot would turn the average person into an automaton. From your memory of your former self, do you have any hint as to which way things pan out related to the shot?
It's, you know, like all futures, they're in the hands of the beings who control them. So all we ever know and all we ever see are future possibilities, and we can change anything at any time. And what I would say to everyone tonight is, you don't realize how flimsy all of this control is. You could just push it a bit and it will start to fall down. It's up to you whether you do. But the future timeline with, you know, these automatons walking around and a more fear-based scenario is so numerically and statistically unlikely to happen unless you keep cooperating with it. It's just not true. And I keep saying there, you know, are 6 billion people on this planet and a handful of actual real power brokers who issue commands that everybody else slavishly follows. It's not hypothetically possible for the negative future to take over. But the problem comes in when people listen and follow the slave self-projection rather than their infinite being. And this is the time now in our history where it's getting harder and harder to actually go along with the slave self setting. So the future is positive. And the timeline that I'm talking about is here. And it's growing. Keep going with it and don't do anything else off it or apart from it to dilute it or slow it down or hold it back, and everything will be fine.
This is a question. I think this question may kind of come out of some conversations we've had, but there's when we look at nations like the USA or Germany or the UK or wherever, these are land pieces partitioned kind of arbitrarily, and then they're called different than this other place, which is still just land, you know, from the earth. It's all kind of the same, but yet we've defined it in all these ways. So when we look ahead and we think about land, are there places that might be special in certain ways, or might contain a certain influence that we could migrate to or avail ourselves of? Nowadays, we hear about places that are sort of sacred sites, like here in the US, we have Sedona or places like that, or the Southwest, which is very active and alive. But as we kind of look ahead, as the earth is changing and society is changing, are there places like that that we should be aware of?
Well, yes, in every sort of, you know, time and space historically, there are always places, if you like, where the earth would seem to be more powerful for some people, or the actual lines in the earth are gearing up for more changes as opposed to other areas. And it's certainly true that South America has a very dense concentration of patterns for bringing in new, much higher frequencies. That's why actually we've seen quite a lot of very harsh restrictions and conditions in some of those countries. And we also see some quite strong rebellious instincts in Brazil, for example, because they're clued in to something else. In general, high altitude places right now also, it is easier in those places to access, if you like, the positive high frequencies, because they literally don't even carry a lot of the denser, heavier vibrations that might slow you down. And by that I just mean physically. But the fact remains that wherever you are on this planet right now, you're going to have to fight it out. Maybe even literally and metaphorically, is not quite, so much the case. Maybe literally you are going to have to roll your sleeves up and stand up and decide what it is that are your limits. Okay? I don't support violence in any way, but it remains a fact that in history, when there are destructive tendencies on Earth, that often blood is spilt and often people do die. And I remind everybody of, pieces of literature that we still have access to, just about, which remind us that when certain things are harmful and destructive, that it is everybody's duty not to reinforce them, whatever kind of authority or power comes with those ordinances. And then wherever you are, that is the place you need to be to break any negative patterns, and you get them in land masses as well as in human consciousness. And you will then be able to bring forward the more positive timelines. And I remind everybody as well about, in the purification process, I've mentioned this in the past, first when you start off in that bandwidth of purification in your own being, first your own patterns start to drop. And then the whole infrastructure of the slave self starts to crack apart, and you are moving into that more archetypal layer. And then when the hold that the not self has, which is that conglomeration of all the different types of slave self identities that you've ever played out, when that starts to crack apart, you then start to rewrite the actual energy lines, the earth lines in the place where you were born, or where your slave self projected body came in. And then that's huge, because you see, the earth is what is able to hold all of the material forms in place on this planet. It has a very particular type of density field. It's magnetic and all sorts of scientific details, which I shan't go into here. But when we start to break up the coordinates, literally, of where the projection of the slave self actually ties into the materialization apparatus of Earth's body, then the physical reality of the system starts to break down so interminably that there's just no way back. And then wherever you are, that's where it starts to break up. And wherever you were born, whether you're there or not, starts to free up as well. You don't have to be there. It doesn't mean that everybody's got to go to their birthplace. And traditionally what's happened before the death space broke up and entered into more this dimensional space, which happened this year, when you died, or let's say when your slave body dropped, then what was left over from that process and then re-entered the stream of nature would pass through the coordinates of the actual location where the projection of your body turned up. That doesn't happen so much anymore. And what we have now is a very interesting situation where the dead are amongst the living. And of course, all of the slave self system is part of a death realm. which is departing. And as that frequency collapses, then the next frequency up, if you like, from that setting, which is all to do with alien frequencies, and I don't mean extraterrestrials by that. Alien frequencies are those raw ideal forces which lack sometimes compassion or even morality, or a glue in with, if you like, the materialization aspect of the planet that gives you a sense of what really brings harm and what doesn't. That will then become the next non-physical realm, because the death space has gone, and that will start to close in. That's why everybody's talking about disclosure, by the way, and hoping that it's going to come about in the next few years. People are always hoping that that's going to come about. Of course it will one day. It won't be the type of disclosure that you think it's going to be, but the truth of how these different frequency levels are working and what is able then to come into our reality as a result of those settings and the way they mesh with Earth and the materialization technology will become exposed. And then you'll find out that there have been other dimensional beings mixing in and out of the population, and they're not the nice ones, to be honest with you. Let's just put it that way.
We have since you mentioned the death space, we have a question about death here. In your first interview with Teresa and Stephen, you mentioned that those who would die in these times would die a good death. But more recently, you said that those who would die via the vaccine would be like a light bulb stripped of its filament, that they would be left an empty shell. Does this mean they have no more source connection? Has something changed? This does not sound like a good death. Are we on a different timeline, or is it different for people who get the shot versus those who don't?
If you go through any medicalization process, you don't necessarily die. We've got different definitions of death there in that question. If the body drops, let's just go back to slightly more conventional language for a moment so we can understand what we're talking about, right? If the body drops, it's the slave self-technology that drops. And in this time, because the death space has disappeared and the not self is breaking up as well, when all of that technology is dismantling, then in the classical circumstance of death, the multidimensional being shows through, and you are not caught in the cycle of slave self-technology anymore, which is called reincarnation. So it's a great death, or whatever you call it, because you can't die. And that's what actually the religions also have pointed to very accurately, even though that's a very limited frequency of understanding. Okay, so then let's move to the other part of the question, where if you go through a mandatory, medicalization scenario, that's actually about DNA. It's not really about death. Okay, when you are meshed with a physical body that is a projection of the slave self-technology that deeply that you've actually bought into all of that stuff in the first place and you're going along with it, what's happening is that then you are accepting into your body, which is the densest, most interwoven and entrapped layer of your multidimensional reality, caught here in this earth plane, then the DNA no longer connects with the gold frequency. It can't access it so much. It doesn't work so well. And you change into a different bandwidth, which I call loosely the copper frequency. And I don't mean the metal copper. I just mean the frequency of harmful technology. Okay, and just because something's made of copper does not mean it is harmful technology. Okay, I mean technology that does harm. You could say it operates on what I am calling the copper frequency. Okay, so then it's like you're still alive. You haven't dropped the body. I mean, you could say metaphorically you are dead because you haven't got so much access to all of your multi-dimensional self, and that's not a great thing. But you still are classically in the body. You just have less access and control over your reality, even less control than what you had, which wasn't that much within the slave self paradigm anyway. And it's more irreversible. Once you're caught in that and you lose the access to the DNA setting, you can't actually switch back, if you like, into the infinity setting and the gold frequency that then upgrades the DNA. You move into the synthetic range and you start to actually shed in the opposite direction your multidimensional identity and the possibility of embodying that. And you go down a different timeline. There's still life there, but what type of life is highly debatable. And of course, the part of you that's multidimensional gets confined into a smaller and smaller set of coordinates within this earthly reality. And that's why we're seeing all the control and restriction on the external. It's exactly what's happening, if you like, in that deeper bandwidth within the hookup between DNA and not having access to the gold frequency. It's just a mirror. And once you go down that timeline, your body changes. We become transhuman, and we start to then take on the technologies that are governing that set of requirements instead. And that's under the control of negative high frequency beings. And those negative high frequency beings, not to go too deeply into it tonight, because that will be a group probably straight after the American election, but let's see what happens. We will need to go into that area to really, kick open the can of why there are beings who really want to turn up here through the slave self projected body and come into the materialization of Earth's field, and what their synthetic reality has involved, and what it's about, why they're doing what they're doing and why they're attempting to do it, because that's a very fascinating chapter of this universe and its history.
We've had a number of questions about the leaf people.
Oh, of course.
So why don't we hear from you about the leaf people and kind of who or what they were and their relationship connection to us now, and maybe even like why are they kind of rising to the level of consciousness? Why are they important to be talking about now?
Okay, so let's qualify this. First of all, by leaf people, I mean pre-human. And by pre-human, I mean before the slave self technology turned up. And the slave self technology is what created the body projection and the whole DNA setup that we have now, and created the human being. Okay, so in a general sense, when I use that term, I mean before that design process occurred, which was overseen by that rowdy set of a few different visitors. Okay, so you could say that on world, you then had whatever was going on this planetary surface, and we've got to be very careful here because it wasn't at all like anything we can really compute through our senses right now. But whoever and whatever was here in the way that it was before all of that happened, it ran more along the lines of nature. It ran more along the lines of sound. And you see that written and encoded in some of the ancient manuscripts and histories. Actually, they're remembering very inaccurately a shadow of what was, but there is truth in it. It was more a non-physical, and certainly there wasn't a kind of body design like we have now. The multi-dimensional being existed in a completely different way. It was much lighter, and there wasn't really a physical form, and the earth didn't even operate that way at that time. So you could say they And that body of beings, consciousness, non-physical reality, and it wasn't even the sense of, individuals or anything like that, or even collectivity at that time, but we have to use some words. They were the leaf people. They became entrapped and enmeshed with that slave self technology. You've got the leaf identity in you if you are here in this reality today. And what's happening is that the infinity spark that runs through this whole universe that was in the leaf people, that got encased, if you like, in that slave self projection, is now moving beyond the setting of the leaf people, the setting of the slave self, and through the technology of desire and dreaming, the DNA of the slave self is being upgraded through the gold frequency and changing. So we don't really want to fixate too much on the leaf people. It's a great chapter of this planetary history, but once you take away the slave self out of that equation, it will look and feel very differently to how we might conceptualize it here. So I don't want to start getting into alternative histories too much, or truthing in terms of a real past as opposed to a false past and all of that, because it all collapses when we get past the slave self. But that's who the leaf people were. And I just emphasize again that, some of the visitors who turned up and interacted with the leaf people, they did not have a negative agenda, but that's what happened as a result of all of the outcomes of the slave self. And then the leaf people became this other type of much heavier, denser existence. And we're sorting all of that out.
You mentioned in recent tracks on the supermoon that there would be loopholes and injunctions related to our financial obligations. Can you say more about this? Should we not pay our debts? And is relief coming soon? What is debt anyway?
Well, there are loopholes and injunctions all the time because, of course, any slave system never follows its own rules and forgets to paper over the cracks. And progressively, those loopholes will become glaringly obvious. And according to who you are, you'll either come across them or you'll choose to use them. And also vast sections of the system will fall apart because it just won't work anymore, because those loopholes have, loosened the foundation of what it was that was covering them over in the first place. So it's kind of like imploding from the inside out anyway. But if you look carefully, you can see every day that a vast amount of things are not being monitored anymore. Whereas in other areas, you're getting more monitoring and restriction and control. And actually, it's a time of great freedom. And that's the way you need to think about all of it. This is a time of freedom, not a time of restriction. And your multidimensional self is continually moving you to embody in the areas of freedom and to push aside the areas of restriction as and when that comes up for you to do in the way that is right for you. It's that dual aspect. So yes, they will come up, and well, it's all over the internet. You've only got to do a little bit of searching to find out the history of our economic and political and legal system and what rules and statutes still stand that uphold your freedom and no need for restriction. You can use them.
I listen to channeled ETs, and it always seems to be positive info, which seem encouraging, saying things about going within for answers, connect to source, etc. I have not heard you speak about positive higher dimensional beings, only negative ones. Can you confirm that there are also positive higher dimensional beings and share your opinion on this?
All the positive higher dimensional beings are here. And there are a very few that are not in the body, which are probably the best way to put it, is quite far away from the density of this time and space right now. And they do not really intervene with planetary affairs or human affairs, because the infinity spark is in each one of us, and there are positive higher dimensional beings here already, and it is up to us to sort it out. So that's why I often say nobody's coming in terms of, you know, maybe a Starfleet that's going to show up. In the future, when the positive timeline is more established and we've got past this very messy patch, which most of us won't see, our children will see it, then we will see more positive high frequency beings turning up who will seem even more fantastic than maybe even what you might think is quite fantastic in terms of what even, you know, what you're seeing around the purification space and what's happening in this group tonight and some of the crazy things that I'm saying. It will be even more open and unfettered in terms of, you know, the way that it shows up in your own senses, because you are able to compute that. And, you know, when people talk about, you know, aliens and extraterrestrials and all of that kind of thing, you know, there are no sort of beings on other planets in the way that we've been taught through movies and books. That's the way our senses have organized it. So it's not like they're going to turn up on spaceships or, you know, the way that we've been given images and thoughts of it. There are high frequency beings out there of a positive nature, but they don't operate like that. And when it's possible for them to show up here and necessary, then that will happen in the latest organization of consciousness that works, if you like, for the frequency that's embodied during that time. And that version that you're getting now, say through someone like myself, or the version that you're getting in other examples on Earth, is the way that it's happening now for this time, and that's what you have.
You know, I was going to ask a follow-up because many people kind of refer to specific civilizations, but I think you just covered it, which was very helpful. So I'll turn it over to Teresa.
Yeah.
We have a few questions about how our bodies are changing. You've mentioned in a recent track about extreme body changes, difficult to physically countenance and emotionally accept. How are our bodies changing? How will they change?
Yes, it's such an endurance run. Can't sleep, won't sleep. The body's, you know, stretching, changing, digestion. Oh my God, you know, so difficult, isn't it? You can't digest what you used to. And that's even before we get into the whole topic of toxins and environment and all of that. The, you know, frequency setup of the body, which is informing physical form, is meaning that we in general are finding density either more desirable or less desirable according to what our instructions say. And there's so much confusion about it all as well, because obviously the system out there, which is based on biochemistry and nutrition, which is a more closed system and has its own rules, is not flexible enough and not big enough for all the different permutations that we're finding. And some days you don't know if it's just a headache or a tumor or a high frequency change, or what the hell it is. And that's the thing. You don't know. And that's the psychological aspect is perhaps the most difficult thing for the physical body right now, because some people will actually leave because psychologically they cannot cope with what's happening. And then the body apparatus cannot actually change to hold all of the multidimensional aspects. I'm not talking about huge numbers of people. Most people who leave will leave because they've done something very silly, like going along with an agenda that is destructive. There's common sense behind it. But some people will also simply find that the body hasn't upgraded enough to hold the multidimensional consciousness, and then it's, you know, very hard to actually stay in existence, and psychologically there is breakdown or even suicidal tendencies sometimes. In general, the tools that are available through the purification space, as they always have been, are for that body upgrade. The purification tracks bring you many things that help. I've started even calling them fixes or patches during the immersion. I don't like to use that language too much because it sounds a little bit techie and might confuse people in thinking that, you know, I'm into some type of, you know, androidy or computery programmy thing, which I most certainly am not. But, you know, while the DNA is actually being changed by these new frequencies, which I'm calling loosely the gold frequency, you know, there are all sorts of things that are coming up to assist humans with their body becoming more suitable for these higher vibrations and the full ability of the DNA to flourish. It's uncomfortable, and it will be, but you will survive.
Dear Jacqueline, why are so many people, especially youngsters, conflicted about their sexuality? Are we going to become genderless beings, or is it sickness as a result of denatured food sources, etc., as is particularly apparent in the USA?
Oh, I think it's all of it. But on the whole, multidimensional identity does not really strongly recognize the narrow typologies that we have around sex, gender, identity, etc., etc. We are still so primitive in our thought systems and our investigations and discoveries and understandings of the meshing between our multidimensionality and our biology. When you get down to it, it really boils down to the specific instructions within each individual. So, you know, this is why some people will be affected by their environment, and then maybe their choice in life in any area, whether it's sexuality, whether it's job, or, you know, choice of clothing or whatever, it may be affected by environment. And then another time it will be to do with the DNA. Another instance, it's the multidimensional identity upgrading the DNA and then bringing in a whole realm of possibilities that's not very known so far here on this planet. It's all these different scenarios, and they are all possible and they are all permissible, and it's up to us individually and collectively, first of all, to move into a more enlightened strategy of non-judgment, and then for each of us to decide within our own sovereignty what is right for us and move from that frequency. Equality and tolerance.
Yeah.
I mean, even
Jacqueline.
tolerance is a little bit of a nasty word, isn't it? Because it kind of says that there's something to be intolerant of.
Yes.
It's an openness. I mean, language is always this problem, isn't it? There's always something left out. But we need to think of inclusivity and then judging for ourselves on a much broader frequency level, whether that is really harming and causing destruction or bringing benefit for all beings. And there are so many things we could be looking at more usefully to think about of whether it brings harm other than in the areas of identity. Identity will just get more and more multivariate on every level, and thank goodness for that.
Jacqueline, I am still in a regular job. Though I love my job in the company, I feel my presence is adding balance and integrity. I work for a company in holistic medicine and skincare. The foundation of the company is built on beautiful values. After you explain that almost everyone will lose their job in the future, I wonder if it is pointless what I do every day. Yet I don't feel any other calling that ignites my fire. Will this happen at the right time for everyone, or will some companies survive?
Nothing is pointless, because the people that you are interacting with when you do your job are benefiting from your frequency, whether you realize it or not, and whether they know it or not. And you are positioned in exactly the right place amongst all these different coordinates of life and existence, meshing in with this planet right now. When your job's not there, you can't do it anymore. It's as simple as that. And if you don't need to be in that job anymore, it's not right for you, it will be very hard to do it progressively. So, some people jump earlier because they know it's not right for them, and they are either in the luxury position of being able to jump, or they're brave enough to jump, even though they might not be able to materially do it, and they just do it. But it doesn't matter which one it is, it will still work out in the right way for you, even if you make a mistake with it. The slave self is absolutely conditioned to wriggle in the trap of always being wrong, whatever it does. So when that kind of thing is going on for you, just realize that your multidimensional being doesn't give a shit. Okay? And that will then reposition everything. And then the slave self will become subject again to that purification that your multidimensional self is continually pouring out into this system.
We had a few questions about the moon.
Oh,
I will read this one, which came through in the chat. Is the Earth's moon a naturally occurring celestial body, or was it placed where it is to interfere with life on this planet and our activation in DNA?
I'll tell you a very interesting story. When I was at Cambridge University, I sat on a table with someone who was very puzzled about how the moon could possibly be there and function the way it did. Now, I can also tell you that academics wonder all sorts of things. But I thought it was a very interesting conversation, and that there's certainly thought within scientific circles that there are some very curious anomalies and things that are totally unexplainable and that shouldn't be there about the moon. What I would say is that the moon most certainly is not what we have been taught it is, just about like every single other thing that we've been taught on this planet. Some of that is error, some of that is very definitely deliberate. But actually, no planetary body is able to influence us negatively anymore once you start embodying your infinite being. We are the ones who control all of that, actually. We have the technology to do that through the new frequencies. So no worries.
And seems relevant to the patterns we've been discussing. If I delete God, what will replace God so deeply inside of me? Who or what do I turn to now?
This is a great question, When your frequency is still trapped within the slave self, you can feel hollow and empty when you come across the frequency possibilities of deleting the slave self and everything that's hooked up with the construct of God. And let's just go one step back, because there's been a lot tonight and we're coming towards the end now. A lot of you are working extremely hard physically in the space tonight, and it's getting a little bit wavy for you. So when the slave self technology was designed, part of that involved also creating an image of an authority that was greater than the being that was hooked up with that slave self technology. And that image that is called God was made in the image of those who created the slave self. Nothing to do with the infinity of this universe. And that infinity of this universe, it exists in and also outside, but let's say for language conveniality, It exists in each and every being. It is your creativity, it is your communion, it is your infinite setup. It is all of that apparatus of pure love that we can talk about. But while you're still operating in the bandwidth of the slave self, you can mentally know that God is a concept created within the confines of the slave self. You can be going through the purification process of the slave self being dismantled and the not self breaking up, but you're still not yet at the stage where you're directly accessing all of that infinity spark, all of that gold frequency internet, and that interrelatedness with all beings, and you're in that awful space where you're just going, and it feels like a death, it feels like grief, you feel hollow and empty, and anything is better than feeling that because you don't know if it's going to end and you can't control it. And, you know, even in meditation states, although it's not quite the same thing, you can get trapped in other worlds where you even start to feel bliss, or you can feel nothingness, or you can feel this in-between state where you're not really physical anymore and you're in a non-physical or astral realm. And that's where you start to still be subject to duality, and you start to feel, you know, the opposite of all of the positive side of those concepts that are being dismantled. So if God was really loving for you and gave you comfort, then when all of that stuff is happening and you're in that more liminal zone, then you just feel the opposite. You even feel afraid, and you feel that you might even become subject to something dark, or you just feel very fearful because you're losing all your margins of what you knew. But actually you're quite safe because you are expanding back into that bigger wavelength of your multi-dimensional being. And when that starts to embody and everything swaps over, it's literally like a flipping inside out almost. That's the way we might conceptualize it anyway. Once that takes a very deep hold, then any negative state becomes the smallest part of you rather than the biggest. But while that's all coming down, it feels the other way round. So tenacity, endurance, patience, compassion with yourself. And that's what a lot of the materials in the purification space are for. Besides just relaxing, I always say, keep going. Keep going. Just keep going.
Jacqueline, I know we've been going for a long time here. We have about 2 more questions. How do you feel about that? And then we'll wrap up.
Let's do it.
So we've received a lot of questions about children's school and mandatory measures. So I'm going to try to use one of these here. How do we protect our children in countries where going to school is mandatory, such as in Germany? Is the only way to get out of the country, or is the truth coming so fast that this system will collapse and no one will send their kids to school anymore under these mandatory conditions? What do we do?
Bit of a passive question, that one, but a good question. And it's just making me realize that I didn't completely answer everything that was asked about young people earlier as well. Okay, so some of the young people get referred to as the sort of snowflakey generation. They have very light bodies. A lot of them are here to hold down a certain frequency that is, let's say, seeding the genetics for future generations, and all they've got to do is show up here and then leave. So there's a lot of young people who don't want to get involved in any of this stuff going on. They think the mask is even great because it's a sign of resistance in their heads, and they just can't wait for it all to stop and go back to normal because they're convinced that's what's going to happen. They disagree with parents who may be very concerned, and they even want more of the mandatory stuff so they can get rid of the old order. That's their kind of mixed up way of obeying their own instructions. So I just wanted to put that into the mix before I answer the question. There's also a younger generation coming in now who are real sort of tear it down kind of guys. They're not going to be very compromising. They're probably going to be judging us very harshly. And they're going to be helping to speed the rebuilding of the new society with healthy technologies, more advanced ways of thinking about economic exchange. And also, they're going to bring amazing skills and insights and abilities to healing and medical paradigms as well, with and without technology. Now, schools and all of that. You see, the problem here is the word mandatory. It's not really about schooling, even though it comes up in the whole area of schooling. And you've got so many things going on there. On the one hand, as parents, often we feel that we even need some kind of alternative space, even if it's not a school, for our young people so that they have healthy interactions, they learn outside of the family unit as well as inside it, and they need to go somewhere, be doing something and really embodying their own independence. And that gets mixed up then with the whole notion of school, which, you know, in some areas does provide that, but most doesn't, and is under a whole other construct that we know is more fashioned on actually, you know, indoctrination. So when we say, you know, what do we do about mandatory schooling? Well, it's the same as what you do about all the things that are mandatory, which are harmful in your opinion. You ask yourself, am I going to do this or not? You make a decision and then you do or you don't do it. And in these times, you've got far more scope than ever if you decide to choose, I'm not going to do it. If you're in a country where it is the law for that schooling or anything to be mandatory, well, what frequency is the law on, is the question now. You see, now it's not so embedded in the normative range of everyday reality. It's fringe. It's conspiracy theory, actually. And if you want to put it that way, it all resonates in exactly the same bandwidth. All of that stuff that gets called you must. So you are the judge. And I know that's really difficult and it's really, really frightening. But it is not about trying to find somewhere else necessarily where it's more relaxed, unless that's a natural pathway that's already opening up and is available to you. It will be short term, and then you're still going to have to face this question at some point. It's more about collectivity now. Some of you will need to organize things outside of the system, whether it's mandatory or not. And some of you will decide to more actively resist and impeach. And it's going to be very messy because the schooling question will come up first before everything else, because it concerns also whether our young people have access even to those arenas. And if you don't agree with mandatory medicalisation, then isn't it the case that you won't be able to send even your young people into those mandatory arenas anyway? So what the hell will happen then? If you're in a country where it's mandatory then to medicalise and go into a school arena, you've got to really start making decisions about now what you're going to do. Where is the frequency of that for you? Bearing in mind, and I said this in March during the immersion earlier this year, be careful what you choose. Think of your children. You know what it really means if you do those things. It's very, very uncomfortable and it's very painful. But like all these things, prevention is better than cure. It's up to us. And I also add into that, speaking of legal things, when it comes down to it, and this is not very comfortable either, but if your young adult is below a certain legal age, you do still have the decision, even though you, of course, do consult your child, your young adult, your teen, and often you will make a decision together. You are the adult and you provide the duty of care, no pressure. And sometimes I think that people get very confused about, well, you know, the children should make the choice. Well, of course, their choice is very important, but there are a number of different arenas that intersect with all of this. And as the actual adult, often you will be in the position where you have the final say. And you must make that decision, however difficult it is.
Yes, and based on what we're hearing, these kinds of decisions might be in front of us sooner than later.
Of course, because they have been creeping up on us for decades, and
Yeah.
we have really known that, but we just haven't thought about it too much. And in some cases, we haven't wanted to look at it. And then everything will be about numbers. When people worry about surviving, and then they worry about acting independently of others who may turn on them. But when it comes down to it, and when it comes to the protection of your child's life, many people will be of exactly the same opinion, even if they are very scientific and have all the evidence in front of them, that if there is doubt and the possibility of risk to their child, they will not go ahead, and that if that is not a choice they're allowed to make, something will come up. It's just how late you want to leave it all. And then it will be about numbers. The more people who are together, the quicker all of this is over. It's heading one way if you look at it in those terms. The sooner, the better.
Yeah, well, we knew we'd get to the big V at some point, so but maybe we can end. Final question on a slightly different note. You've said a number of times that the future is positive. Can you talk more specifically about what that means?
Yeah. Well, it doesn't matter whether we get the hard way or the easy way. All of this is going to fall away because the frequency is changing and we are overwriting the technology of the slave self, and we are hooking up with those higher celestial vibrations that embody the infinity of us. So even if you classically drop the body, there will be a positive future. And actually, in the circumstances of these times, your multidimensional reality will come online even quicker. Okay? It doesn't matter which way you look at it, it's win-win. But in the meantime, contemplating what you might need to go through to experience that and see that take place can often make you feel that it is not very positive at all. But the overall context is completely positive. You will see in your lifetime an absence of restriction and constraint to an unparalleled degree. It might mean a few uncomfortable things physically in the meantime, but there will be an absence of the bullshit. A really huge comparative absence of the bullshit, because the negative timeline is set to implode. And it can't do anything else. It's just where we're all positioned. And that's a frequency matter. The more your frequency is congruous with the new identity coming in, and the less it is operating on the frequency of the slave self, then the more straightforward and quick it will be, however uncomfortable. That's what I mean by a positive future. Are you all going to be enslaved in FEMA camps? There's a lot of people who'd like to make you think that's the case. And if you're highly suggestive and you're still controlled by a lot of the things behind the slave self, then you may well sleepwalk into that if you're not careful. And you'll keep making choices that endorse the suggestion of that and even start to bring it about more and more. But is that going to happen wholesale? It's impossible, even with the most advanced technology. And by the way, that advanced technology that is actually destructive and harmful, there's a design fault. Part of the design fault is called the fuck up factor, because when you get lots of people involved with that kind of thing, however clever the technology is, those who actually operate it, who are not so clever, they don't do such a good job with it. But also where the intelligence comes from to actually even bring about the harmful effects of that technology. And of course, let's be careful. I'm not saying that technology is harmful. It really isn't. We're going to have amazing technology in the future, which is very healthy. But where the harmful technology comes in and the design that's in those systems plays out with all the stuff that's going on this planet, it's actually going to help with the breakdown, because it's so at odds with what is going on. And you've seen it even so far with all this stuff they keep trying to roll out. First you've got the hopeless bureaucrats who can't roll it out, and then even the system doesn't work properly even when they try to roll it out successfully, and glitches and this and that, and that's even before you get into environmental conditions, and there's all sorts of things going on, and the frequencies just don't support it. Does that mean that you should sit back and do nothing? Absolutely not, because then it means that although there will be a positive future, it will be more painful and longer, and more lives will be lost, possibly. So passivity is not a recipe for anything except pain. That's very important to remember.
Well, Jacqueline, thank you so much. We
Thank
did
you.
go 2.5 hours, and I thank you for
On the dot.
your generosity with your time and your energy.
It's been a pleasure for me.
It's been tremendous.
Yeah, thank you so
If
much.
there's anything that we didn't touch or anything you want to leave us with before next week, please let us know now.
I think just a reminder, please, everybody, about your aftercare. If you're new to this space, please join the Reboot group tomorrow so that you can continue with this process, because it could be a little bit like going off of the end of a cliff if you're not careful. It's a big thing for your system, your choice, of course. And if you're on the immersion, I really hope you've enjoyed it. It's still not over. And also a big thank you to the possibility for this donation behind the immersion to even take place. An amazing thank you to Switzerland, where the immersion is taking place. Not just the beautiful rocks and trees and rivers, but the Swiss people and the most incredible country that this is, that cradles the purification space in this stage of the journey. And thank you to everybody who is making this possible, not least my very, very devoted team who work all hours selflessly to make this possible for all of us.
Yes, you have
Thank
a
you,
marvel.
Stephen and Teresa, of course, as ever.
Thank you.
Thank you, and to thank you everyone who joined. This is such a powerful event.
Yes, really hats off to the nearly 1,200 people who hung with us the whole 2.5 hours. It's really
Well done.
quite
And
amazing. Some
the
real stamina.
fraction who are on the rewatch. So I look forward to seeing you all again very soon. Much love.
Much love,
And
Jack.
see you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.